Super. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Such a great turnout. Really pleased to see how many people are interested in hearing about the NESP2 Climate Systems Hub. For those that haven't met me, I'm Jaci Brown. I'm based at CSIRO. Taken over as the NESP Hub lead since May last year, so I'm up to 12 months now. I'm taking over from Simon Marsland. I'm also joined today by Sarah Boulter, who's our Climate Adaptation Initiative Lead, and she's going to give part of the presentation as well. And we've got Amelia on the line. She's the Program Manager, and many other of the team also. Today is a presentation of the work plan for the remaining part of the NESP Hub, for the Climate Systems Hub. I think there's going to be lots of questions because we've got lots of information, so we'll leave questions to the end. And also, if you have any further questions, please email them to us at info@nesp2climate.com.au. I'll be putting the names of the project leads up, but if you want to email us, we can direct you to the appropriate person. So I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we live in Australia. For me, in Hobart, it's the Muwinina people, and we pay our respects to elders past and present and recognise the important role traditional knowledge plays in understanding Australia's climate. A very big part of what we do in the Climate Systems Hub and a big part of our research portfolio, as you'll see. So what is NESP? I hope people on the line have heard of NESP, the National Environmental Science Program. Our hub is one of four, the Climate Systems Hub. There's marine and coastal, resilient landscapes, and sustainable communities and waste. Each hub has an initiative lead. That's a difference from last time we had NESP in NESP 1. And for us, we have the Climate Adaptation Initiative. So that's Sarah Boulter leads that. And her role is to interact with the other hubs and help deliver the climate information across hubs and feedback to us what they're doing. So we're more of a comprehensive package rather than for individual programs. For us, we're established in 2021. As I said, second phase, it's a 7-year program. This hub will run till mid-2027, but the research program finishes at the end of 2026. So we've got about 18 months left. The Climate Systems Hub has a number of partners. CSIRO leads the hub, but we partner with the Bureau of Meteorology, ANU, UTAS, UNSW, Monash, and Melbourne, so 5 universities as well. But a really big plus this time around has been partnering with the state governments, and we'll talk about that more, but really making sure that what we do federally is delivered into the hands of the states where we know a lot of the action happens. The hub has really three big priorities that sit above the research program that we do. One of those is making sure that our research is co-designed, because there's no point doing it if no one's going to use it. A strong focus on Indigenous partnerships and the Cross-NESP Adaptation Initiative for Climate Adaptation. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of those. For our Indigenous program, this hub and the previous one, the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub, has developed and continued the National First Peoples platform on climate change. This is an independent platform. They meet together and discuss issues around Indigenous communities and climate change and help guide how we put our research programs together and meet to talk about climate risk and engage on our Indigenous projects. Co-design is also a big part of what we do. As I said, there's no point doing this if no one uses it. And it's very easy as a scientist to go off in the corner and do some really exciting stuff, but nothing ever comes of it. So there's been a really big focus on training our project staff around how to do co-design, how to make sure there is that end user, and how to do the research with them. And that's thanks very much to Ramona Della Posa, our knowledge broker, and her team from the States, and also with Sarah Boulter around the Adaptation Initiative, helping to change the way we think. I was chatting to one of my colleagues in the NESP program a little while ago about this, and we were reflecting on how much our research has changed in 20 years. 20 years ago, we were sitting in our office doing our research and writing papers, but now it's very much about who's going to use that research and defining the need and making sure it does get used. So I've been so proud to see this change through this hub. The knowledge broker network that Ramona leads has 4 others, Julia, Susan, Heidi and Helen, who I think are also on the line, that help a two-way discussion. The science that NESP is doing, how do we deliver that into the states, but also hearing about what the states need and helping that shape our research. Okay, so standing back, there's a lot we could do in 7 years for climate research and climate adaptation. And what I'm showing you here is a schematic idea of what that value chain looks like. We can't do everything, but we do bits right along that value chain, and no one project does everything. So if you look at this schematic, which is just for NESP, this is not all science that's ever been done. It would be much bigger and much more complicated. Over on the left-hand side, you've got global and local climate observations. NESP doesn't do that, but we do rely on those observations. NESP Climate Systems Hub looks at the global climate modelling, the carbon modelling, through to the climate processes, taking that to high-resolution modelling, risk analysis, targeted climate projections for particular people and needs, translation of that information and climate data, developing climate tools for people to use, then importantly, the Indigenous engagement, the knowledge brokering and the climate adaptation research. This is then, we have a little bit of a footprint into policy, industry, consultation, social license and stakeholder engagement, but offers others pick that up and use our research for ultimately impact and change for greater good across Australia. So as I said, no one project does all of that. They often do 2 or 3, but they all link together so that we have a comprehensive package. So that's a lot about concepts and ideas. What are we actually going to do? We've started our research program at the start of this year. So we had a lot of 2-year projects that started and some that have continued. There's 13 projects that will go to the end of 2026. I think a simple way to jump in to all that information is to consider them in 4 categories: projections of Australia's climate and carbon, the science of climate hazards, capacity building and climate literacy, and climate adaptation. And not surprisingly, those 4 groups match across that value chain, picking up a few hexagons each and definitely linked together. So all our project leads are talking to each other and learning together to deliver on that greater good. So what I'm going to do with Sarah is go through each of those projects. We've got a slide on each project to give you an overview. The project leader's name is in the top right-hand corner of each slide, but I'd really encourage you, if you're interested in being involved in any of these projects or you have any questions, to post a question, ask us at the end or send us an email for more information and we can link you up to that project lead. Okay, let's start on the left-hand side with the access, development and delivery to CMIP7. So access is the global Earth systems model that gets submitted to CMIP7 for IPCC. Now, we don't do this alone in NESP, we do it with the Access NRI. If that model wasn't submitted to CMIP7, it wouldn't get the gold tick that this is a credible climate model and wouldn't get used in international standards and assessments of how we're doing our mitigation and adaptation. So it's important if we're in that. If we don't, people wouldn't use our model and then there'd be no point having it. So it's important we have a model, and it's also important because this model represents Australia's landscapes and the questions Australia has. We can't rely on other countries, particularly the US, to spend a lot of time refining those climate models over Australia. So very important that NESP is contributing part of this effort to keep the global climate model, Earth system model, I should say, because it does both climate and carbon balances for Australia. Another part of what we do is carbon, so global carbon budgets and carbon sinks. And there's 3 parts to this project: an international perspective, a national perspective and a local perspective. So internationally, our project team is part of the discussion of what those greenhouse gas scenarios should look like, that everyone should be considering globally on how we plan our future. Nationally, we're developing the cable land model. So that's the one that's going to prioritise what Australia's landscape looks like in the global model. And also assessing our global carbon budget for 2050, because Australia needs to be able to assess how it's going towards those net zero goals. Otherwise we wouldn't know, right? Locally as well, we're also looking at a case study to look at how effective local land management is for changing those carbon sinks. So quite a cascade of activities through that carbon project. Stepping away from the bigger modelling now into projection verification. And we ran some workshops in NESP around what stakeholders wanted to know about climate attribution. So by that I mean, was this extreme rainfall due to climate change? Will it happen again? Will it be more frequent under climate change? And there's a great study that was done on what people want to know, like what the questions have that would make a difference for how they make decisions. The challenge is, to do that, we need to have the climate models at a level that they can answer those questions, and we're not quite there. We need to be assessing whether the models really are showing the correct frequency and properties of those trends and hazards so that we can answer those questions. And for those models to be working properly, we need to make sure that the models are properly representing things like El Nino that brings us drought. The models aren't showing us proper El Ninos, they're not showing us drought, so then we can't talk about climate change attribution of drought. So what this project's doing is building the scaffolding and the models so we can begin to answer the questions that the stakeholders have. The fourth of our climate projections type work is called Uncharted Climate Futures. So we've talked about the climate models and how great they are and going to tell us all these future things. And the typical process we do with those climate models, we take the CMIP, the Global International Models, we downscale them through Cortex. So this is things like NARCLIM and ACS, lots of scenarios and ensemble members to see what's happening, do all the post-processing, and you get some climate projections. But climate models, as wonderful as they are, don't show you everything that could possibly happen in the future climate. There's different bits missing, or they don't get particular storylines. So this project is looking at other things that might happen outside the climate models. They're starting by doing some co-design with the users that really care about these big picture changes like APRA and Treasury, doing the research behind that. Things like, what if we go to a La Nina-like change, different forcing scenarios and overshoots, and translating that information to go with the climate projections to help people that are really trying to understand 50 years to 100 years from now, what are the big risks? What might we be expecting? Okay, so that's our 4 climate projections and modelling and carbon type work. Now we'll move into the hazards. We've got 3 projects here. One is on marine heat waves on coastal resources in southeast Tasmania. Now, marine heat waves are a big issue already. We're seeing those heat waves come with a big effect on fisheries. There's lots of things that affect aquaculture and fisheries, and climate is just one piece of that puzzle. What we're finding is we don't actually have a current story about what those marine heat waves look like right now. So it's harder to understand what the future might be and how that would change without a really good baseline. So this team is tracking that baseline. What does it look like? What affects it? And using a suite of models, which ties back to the access modelling to understand where we are now and where we might be going in the future. One question that always pops up here is, if you're doing it for Southeast Tasmania, why aren't you doing it for everywhere? It's not simple cut and paste to every coastal region because there's different ocean currents and different complexities, but this is the starting point to get right for this one, and then it can be taken to other coastal regions. Moving now to rainfall, a really big issue for Australia over the last few years. Short duration rainfall extremes are particularly concerning in cities, particularly where you've got impermeable surfaces. So a lot of concrete, you get a lot of rain, that water's got to go somewhere because it can't be soaked up. The recent Australian rainfall and runoff guidance identified that there was a real gap around that sub-daily rainfall, so really short burst, high resolution rainfall that's happening. So the team here have looking for a few cities to do case studies on those historical trends of the extreme rainfall, how that's changing and how we can better model that into the future. So it's the research behind modelling that high resolution rainfall that will be then picked up into things like ACS and 21st century weather to improve our understanding in the future. Another rainfall project, it's quite different, even though they're both about extreme rainfall. The last one was looking at extreme bursts in one city. This project is about extreme rainfall in compound events. So the simplest example here is it might be okay for your house to survive an extreme rainfall, but if there's extreme wind that blows the roof off, and then you get the extreme rainfall, you're in for a tough time. So it's when things happen together, strong winds, high seas, after bushfires, events that can occur concurrently after each other in quick succession, that's where we see the biggest damage and the greatest risk. So the team here are talking to stakeholders about what they think their concerns are in compound events, mapping the location and frequency, understanding the climate drivers behind those compound events, um, understanding how they're going to change into the future and helping stakeholders assess how they put that into their planning. So it won't solve everyone's problems everywhere for every sort of compound event, but when you go generic, that's harder. So doing a few case studies of things that really matter to people to try and find those solutions. Moving now to our climate literacy and communication section. So this one here is communicating coastal floods. We have spent loads and loads of money in Australia understanding our coastal inundation, sea level rise. It's a really big issue for Australians as we live around the coastline. There is so much information out there. This project really looks at how we make sure people are getting that information in a way they can use it so that it's actionable. So the team here, Julian and Helen, are looking at the Canute tools that have been built, looking at the different ways to explain the changes in coastal inundation. They're doing that with 2 case studies, one of those in Torres Strait, going to those communities, showing them maps of their land, giving them different metrics, asking how they're considering the decisions they put in and what might change their minds in the goal of building the tools that they need. So this one here is inundation over the last 30 years compared to the next 30 years. And when you zoom in, you can see particular runways or schools or buildings that are going to be affected. Building for the future. We already know that it's getting hotter and we're living in buildings that were designed for the past climate. The climate of the next 10 years, the next 20, the next 30, the next 50, we know is going to get hotter, and our buildings need to be energy efficient for that and prepared. So what do they need? What do our building people need to know to make that happen besides, oh, it's just going to get hotter? We can't go and speak to every builder, of course, but the key way for us to have influence here is to be talking to the people that are designing the National Construction Code and the Australian Buildings Codes Board. What requirements should they be setting for the buildings of the future? So the hub is talking to all the key people. Ramona's doing a fabulous job bringing all those different groups together, such as the Building Codes Board, specialists in energy, and the climate scientists to figure out what should go into those building codes. It's not straightforward. It's not just let's just download a climate model and get some information. We've seen that go wrong before where people have just taken averages from 2050. It's the extremes and the subtleties in the climate that we need to be prepared for, those long heat waves or extreme heat waves that happen through the system. And I'm going to call it the art of pulling that together is finding out what matters to the builders, what matters to the energy people, and what the climate scientists are saying, and finding that sweet spot of information to help design those regulations. Our Indigenous-led literature and products to inform national and international processes is being led by our Indigenous facilitator, Damien Morgan-Boult. So we know that in the IPCC report, there is not a strong voice of Indigenous people and particularly not of Australian First Nations people. So how do we get their perspectives into big important documents like the IPCC? That comes through writing journal articles, and that's not a straightforward way to get those Indigenous First Nations voices into the report. So we've set ourselves the challenge of how can we do that? So we're building some studies across a range of landscapes with sea country and inland country. We're looking at heat waves, coral bleaching, sea level rise, big wet dry, and looking at what those issues are. The difference this time is we're thinking about how to get those into journal papers, Indigenous-led journal papers. So we've got an agreement with the Journal of Southern Hemisphere Earth System Science, Jaci, to have a special issue of these papers. And we're exploring ways with First Nations people to write those papers in ways that are meaningful to Western scientists and to them, that give important messages in time to be picked up by the IPCC. And we're very, very grateful to Q for the extra 800,000 they found to support that travel, because you do need to be on country to do this, and you need to travel a long way away, and it's not cheap. So to really do it in an authentic manner, that funding has made a big difference. So thank you for that. My voice is running out, so I think that's a very good spot to pass Sarah before I lose it completely, to talk about
Thanks,
the
Jackie.
climate adaptation section. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. And so my role in leading the Climate Adaptation Initiative, as many of you know, and it's great to see so many of you here on the line, is really about bringing a coordinated body of adaptation informing research to the whole NESP program. So that means that there's projects in the Climate Systems Hub, but there are also some complementary projects in some of the other hubs as well. And I'll talk a little bit about those towards the end, but focusing on the projects that are currently funded within the Climate Systems Hub. The first one is called Enabling Best Practice Adaptation, and this one has been going since early 2023 and ends at the end of this year. And it was a really important, you know, we talk about foundational climate science. For me, this was sort of almost a foundational climate adaptation research project. For those of you familiar, you know, the journey of adaptation research and practice in Australia has very much been evolving over the past 10 to 20 years. And there was sort of a bit of a hiatus in research and investment in adaptation for a little while there. And so when we began, it was really important to think about, how is Australia progressing in adaptation? There are a lot of what would you call them, like urban myths around the fact that we were all writing adaptation plans but weren't actually undertaking adaptation. And so we set out to look at a couple of things. One was this adaptation progress in Australia. We also wanted to understand something about what enables best practice adaptation, and that led us to think also, what do we mean when we talk about best practice adaptation? So we've done this in a number of different ways. The first is developing the Australian Adaptation Database. This is very close to release, and I should call out to my colleagues, this project is effectively co-led by John Barnett from the University of Melbourne, Alyssa Waters at Monash University, and our really the work is done by our postdoc Tia Brullo, who's very much been, many of you will have met through her work. And so we've been developing this database, pulling together information around what adaptation is happening in Australia at the moment. We've collected about 800 examples of adaptation from around Australia. Each of them gets coded. It's quite a exhaustive process, or exhausting process, coding each entry. And we have about 500 that will be part of the initial release of the database. And so in the next couple of weeks, we look forward to announcing that it's available for people to take a look at. This is giving us an opportunity to understand where and how and what types of adaptation are happening in Australia. And I think that's a really important thing, not just for policy setting, but also providing examples for others to look at what they might do in their space and so on. We've also been thinking about enablers of best practice adaptation, and we have undertaken a literature review which was published last year, looking at what constitutes enablers. And we're following that up at the moment with a series of case studies. The one on artificial reefs is currently available, and there's one on the wine industry coming shortly. And these are focused on unpacking where we've seen an example of adaptation that's been successful, and looking at what are the enablers of that actually happening. And there's sort of a complex story coming out of that, and there are a number of things that enable adaptation to be successful, and we look forward to sort of giving some conclusions on that before the end of the year. And then finally, we've been working to think about what we can describe as best practice. So there's a body of literature out there that says here are all the things that best practice adaptation might look like, and we've been trying to put a lens on it of like, well, what does that mean for practitioners? So if best practice is about just adaptation or about engagement, what does that actually look like in practice? So those are the things that that project is working on at the moment. Next slide, please, Jaci. So that's the first project to talk about. The second one, which began in earnest late last year, is looking at adaptation planning approaches for protected places. So this is a partnership that we have with Parks Australia and the traditional owners of the Kakadu World Heritage Area, but also a second partnership with the Queensland Government and First Nations with connection to the Gondwana rainforest area of Queensland, working there. The projects are really about working. I often talk about adaptation as being learning by doing, and this project is very much an example of that. The project is co-led with Jess Melbourne-Thomas from the CSIRO, Nick McGregor from Parks Australia, and there's a couple of other staff from UTAS and CSIRO, but should also mention our postdoc Claire. I'm having a senior moment. I can't think of her last name. Claire Mason. My goodness, sorry about that. Sorry, Claire. So this is looking at, in both properties, working with the landholders and the rights holders in each property and trying to understand how we can develop or how we can work with them to create a process for building adaptation plans for these protected places. Builds on work we did with the Butler on Gari, and each property that we've worked with have very different governance arrangements, different ambitions, different resourcing, and so it's a useful exercise to understand how we might tackle that in different ways. You can see there that photo, the drawing, that's our project plan for the Kakadu project, and that's been co-developed with our traditional owner partners and with Parks Australia to think about, how do we go about this? And we're currently working on doing a similar sort of thinking with the Gondwana rainforest Queensland section. So that project is ongoing till the end of next year. Thanks, Jaci. And I know that Jenny Steiger is on the call here. She's my brilliant colleague from University of Tasmania who has taken charge of this project. This is very much, I mentioned before about, building adaptation research projects across the whole NESP program. This is really one that all of the hubs have invested in the spirit of that approach. The output of the project is this Adapt Land and Sea portal or information and guidance portal, which is directed at land and sea managers. It's very much intended to provide a support, a place to begin the journey of thinking about adaptation for biodiversity in the context of land or sea management. We're developing it, Jenny's developing it through to co-design with these land and sea managers, and it will contain guidance and tools to help with adaptation planning. Importantly, it's drawing on research that's happening across the entire NESP program to bring together what we can to help support that planning process. So one of the things that the NESP project does incredibly well is develop or co-develop research and outcomes for individual land managers and specific questions. And so we wanted to be able to effectively collate and synthesize and contextualize that information into something that an individual making a decision could, or thinking about the challenge of climate change and adaptation planning for a property or for for policy, had a place to actually sift through and look at that information and understand in the context of how those decisions could be made. We'll also, where there are gaps in the information from NESP, we'll look at what other information is available beyond that. And it's an opportunity for us to also showcase some of the work that's happened both in the previous in the previous research from this hub, from the Climate Systems Hub, the sort of body of evidence that we've built in Australia around climate science and climate hazards, but also some of the work in the project that was finished last year, building the adaptation catalogue for conservation, the Adapt log. So it's bringing together a bunch of those different tools. really, we want this to be something that can make sure that Australia's land and sea managers are well prepared for climate change. And that's, that's an important outcome for the Adaptation Initiative. So great, thanks. This is a bit of a change of tack. This is not a project, but this is something that the Climate Systems Hub set out to do on a bit of a shoestring and some goodwill from the beginning. We recognise that one of the things that NESP does is invests in the next generation of both climate scientists and adaptation experts. And we wanted to be able to help support those, next generation of experts and to give them some opportunities that they may not find elsewhere. So there are a number of early career researcher programs in Australia. Some of the Centres of Excellence have their own programs. The Academy of Science has programs. But what we wanted to create one that was specific to our discipline, but also focus not just on research and academic skills, but actually a much broader professional network, which was about bringing together people that are working in policy and decision making and planning as much as the research. So, one of the things that the NESP program very much champions and which we acknowledge is incredibly important for Australia's future is that collaborative, co-designed, evidence-informed decision making, and so this is really playing into that space. We have 3 different ways that people can participate. We have our Hub Fellows, who are the early career professionals that are employed under our Hub. I've written there the backbone of the Hub. I think that's very honest. Those full-time postdocs that are employed under NESP very much are the ones that are driving and managing the research, so a big shout out to them. But we also include in membership of the Climate College Hub Associates, so anyone who's supervised by Hub members, so this is often PhD, honours or master's students. And then we also open up membership to Hub affiliates, so this is any climate focused professional. We say less than 10 years post-graduation, although sometimes people pop up in the college who, they are a long time since their graduation, but are actually just moving into a new area of work, and this is an opportunity for them to meet some of their peers in this space. And we do things like we have professional development, peer career journey information sessions. We run a monthly webinar. We call them the Lunchbox series, and we invite different people to talk on. We have things around communications. We talk about people's careers. But importantly, which is where this photo comes in, we did last year trial doing a field trip where we took the Climate College on the road and we spent a week in the Northern Rivers. Incredibly productive week, challenging and thought-provoking for our Hub Fellows, where they got to meet people on the ground who often said things that weren't always very palatable to people doing research, but important messages to understand in thinking about their careers. We also built some terrific partnerships, for example, with New South Wales Reconstruction Authority, and we've followed up, done some blogs. So there's been a whole bunch of things that have come out of that first field trip, and we hope to replicate it this year as well. Thanks, Jaci. Okay. And my favourite thing to talk about. So one of the things that I did fairly early in the Climate Adaptation Initiative was to reinstate the National Climate Adaptation Conference. My rationale was that if you want to build impact and get people talking and thinking about adaptation, a conference has proven in the past a really useful way of doing that. So we ran our first NESP Climate Adaptation Conference in 2023 in Adelaide and had about 440 delegates. And so we're doing it again in Perth this year. It's the first time that the conference has been to the West. There's 3 days of the meeting. We have a free early career workshop on the Tuesday before the conference for anyone who's registered for the conference and identifies as an early career professional. And there are a range of different themes. We had over 200 abstracts submitted, and I've just put together the draft program, which is available on our website. And we hope that we'll see more delegates this year. I've conservatively truthfully said 450, but I'm hoping there might be a little bit more than that. So we definitely flagged that as something we'd love to see people coming and joining that conversation around adaptation. For those of you who've worked in adaptation for a long time, you'll understand that it's a concern across a really broad set of systems and sectors. It takes in, a very diverse range of conversations. So this is a really terrific way of hearing from peers that have similar problems but are perhaps in a different sector or in the same sector or system facing similar challenges. That learning by doing, but also learning by sharing, which is very much what we look to do with the conference. Thanks, Jackie.
And you again, Sarah.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then just finally, just wanted to mention the cross-hub projects. Part of this is the work of the initiatives in building these connections across different areas of work across the whole NESP program, but also the work of the knowledge brokers in particularly. Shout out to our hub. I think our knowledge brokers are an amazing network across state and territory and have a very important role in helping to facilitate some of this. But I mentioned the Adapt, Learn and See portal is one where all of the hubs are partnering and putting their money where their mouth is and their effort where their mouth is to help co-develop that. There's some very strong connections for the Kakadu project where there are existing projects from the Marine and Coast and Resilient Landscapes Hub, and we're all meeting and working together to try and make sure that that information feeds into the adaptation plan. There are other projects happening in the Resilient Landscape and Marine and Coastal Hub in the Resilient Landscape Hub, building adaptation plans for the Northern Rivers District and wet tropics. And we're building our own little sort of community of practice, if you like, to help support each other across the projects, developing adaptation plans for different areas. From our hub, we're delivering climate information to support the Northern Rivers project, and that's across a range of our projects, delivering a whole bunch of different information. And then I've been working with the Threatened Species Initiative leader, Helene Marsh, on the co-development of a workshop and report on climate risks for Australia's threatened terrestrial and freshwater species. I've cheekily given a snapshot of the cover. It's still in development. It may not look like that when we're done, but that's underway at the moment. And then our hub has been delivering climate information support for work being carried out by the Sustainable Communities and Waste Hub on nature-based solutions to help communities cope with urban heat. So, it's quite difficult to work across different hubs because of the fact that you have to, it has to be effectively a coalition of the willing, but actually I feel like we've managed to, in the past few years, develop some really great connections and partnerships, and they're definitely some of the more rewarding things that we get to be involved with, that sharing and that success of being able to work together. Thanks, Jackie. I think that's me now, isn't it?
That is. Thank you, Sarah. That's when you put it all together in one big story, there's a lot going on in the next 18 months, which is both exciting and exhausting, thinking about everything we're going to do, as well as putting together a very comprehensive synthesis package, I think, on explaining what we've achieved over that 7 years. And we're meeting in a few weeks in Melbourne to talk about how we're going to do that, rather than just a glossy brochure. What is it that we've achieved and who needs to hear it, and how do we get those messages out there?